Well, thank you again, everyone, for being with us, especially for for being on top of the time change and being here. It seems like when when Lori and I were young and we were raising kids, as hard as we would try to get out the door to church on Sunday, we didn't always make it. But you could be certain there was two Sundays a year that we made it out the door to get to church, and they were the Sundays that the that the clocks had changed and we were either early or late. So it seemed like everything was conspiring against us. So I do appreciate everybody being here this morning, and it's wonderful that we've got this taped and on the internet, so people can join us at any time that's convenient for them. As we're coming up on the Easter holiday. Spring has sprung, no doubt about it. The pollen is just out there, and everything is starting to bloom, and the bulbs are pushing their little heads up through the ground, and the wild onions I guess shallots in the lawn are pushing up everywhere. I had to go out and mow yesterday, and it smelled like I was in a kitchen chopping onions. So we're coming up on Easter time, and in the cultures that for which Christianity is a big part of the culture, of course, this is the most important holiday of the year in Christendom. Now, it's interesting if you study the history of religions, which of course you have to do somewhat in studying for the ministry. But if you study the history of the religions, Christmas was not always a holiday that was celebrated in Christianity, because to the earliest Christians, it wasn't the birth of Jesus that was important; it was the resurrection. Everybody's born, but nobody comes back from the dead. So they kind of frowned upon celebrating Christmas. In fact, in the history of the United States, the first colonists that came over to Massachusetts were the Puritans, and that was against the law to celebrate Christmas. If you didn't show up for work on Christmas, or if you closed your business down on Christmas Day, you could be fined or put in the stocks or whatever it was that they did to punish you in those days. So the focus was on what Easter meant, what the resurrection meant, what the crucifixion and the resurrection meant. This is what was important to earliest Christians. But human beings, we have kind of an urge within us to celebrate at certain times of year. There's something within us that moves, that functions at a level that is way below our intelligence. It doesn't mean it's not intelligent. Perhaps I should say below our level of awareness. There's a stirring within us, a desire within us to celebrate. And people naturally wanted to celebrate around the solstice. You had in the religions of the people who dwelled in the country, we call them the pagans now, but it just meant the people who dwelled in the country. But in the Aboriginal religions, in the first religions of the people, they wanted to celebrate at that time. There was something within the human psyche that wanted to celebrate. The ancient Romans celebrated Saturnalia. And when Christianity started to spread, it had to adopt some sort of a holiday at that time of the year, because people were already celebrating. If Christianity didn't have a holiday, people would go have their secular celebration anyway. So that's when Christmas became a holiday that was celebrated around the winter solstice. Now, I realize we're talking about Easter, and I just told you about Christmas, but it's important. It ties together. The idea of how when new ideas start to spread, when cultures collide, is the way I like to consider it. When cultures collide, what happens is there's a blending of ideas. There's a mixture of ideas that takes place, and this is what in the New Testament terms, this is what the phrase "you can't put new wine into old skins" means to me. Today we're going to talk about what Jesus taught, not what was taught about Jesus, but what Jesus taught. And we're going to talk about that because we are so heavily influenced by traditional Christian ideas in our culture. It's very important for us for each of us individually to come to an understanding. Well, what is this thing called Christianity? Who is this person called Jesus? What does it mean to me? Right? We all have to make it personal. We all have to come to some type of realization and understanding. Right? No doubt about it that the earliest settlers European settlers who came to this country brought their flavor of Christianity with them. You know, when the Spanish went into Central America, and then they pushed up the west coast of what is now the United States. They founded their missions, and that's why when you go to California, you've got San Diego and San Clemente and San Bernardino and San Francisco. They were naming their towns after the different Christian saints that they celebrated, the lives of those saints. When the, as I say, the Puritans came and they brought their brand of Christianity with them. One of the interesting things is that we believe that the people first came to this country from Europe in order to establish somewhere where people could be free to worship in whatever way they wanted. In other words, they were fleeing religious persecution, but what they were really doing was they were trying to start a society that all believed the same way that they did. As Emmett Fox would tell us, is one of the first things the Puritans did when they got here was to hang 3 Quakers in Boston Square, because remember the Quakers, if you think about it, were more what today we would call Gnostics. There's an inner knowing, there's an inner spirit, there's a quickening. In many Quaker churches, there's no clergy. People come together and they sit together to be still and to know. Let the spirit that is within them talk to them. To a very organized, doctrine-oriented way of believing, of course, that was just blasphemy. So even though people came to this country because they were being persecuted, their religious ideas were being persecuted in their old country, they came here, and to some degree they were trying to establish a society where they could believe as they believed, and everybody that was in that society had to believe the way that they did. But what happens is, as any new philosophy, any new idea starts to migrate, as cultures collide, as they start to bang against one another, there's a blending, there's a mixing, kind of a dilution, if you will, kind of a misunderstanding. What happens is everybody is trying to understand the new idea in terms of the way that they already think and they already believe. They're trying to put new wine into old skins. Now, most of what came to us, or what comes to us in Christianity today, comes to us through the writings of the Apostle Paul. It's very interesting to keep this in mind. Paul never personally met the man Jesus. They never met while they were alive together on this earth. Paul's experience is of the Christ, the risen Christ. He had a mystical experience. He was knocked off the horse. He was blinded by the light on the road to Damascus, we're told, which, by the way, is probably a parable, probably a teaching story, not an historical fact, because Palestine and Syria at that time were 2 different governments. For Paul to be going from Jerusalem to Damascus to do something to persecute Christians was probably not historically accurate. But it's not the historical accuracy that's important. We have to understand what all these stories are trying to tell us. What do they mean? So Paul, what he did was he was taking this idea of Christianity, he was taking it out into the greater world of the Mediterranean. Right? So when Christianity first started, it was a sect within Judaism. And there were a group of people who believed that Christianity was only for the Jews, didn't need to go out beyond it. And Paul came along and said, no, this is for everybody. This is something for everybody. And when he got to Greece, when he started to move into the world that was controlled by the Greek thought, they had statues of their different gods. And they had a statue for the yet to be named God, the unknown God. See, they realized that this idea of God was evolving, and they expected that there would be one yet to be named, that there's one that they didn't even know yet. And what Paul did in order to bring them to Christianity, Paul went and he said, now you see that God over there? The one that you haven't yet named? Let me tell you about that God. So he brought Christianity to them in terms that they were already open and receptive. toward. They believed that there was an as yet unknown God. So what happened is the ideas of Christianity then started to blend with the pre-existing ideas that they may have had about what this yet to be named God was like. Many years ago, Lori and I had an opportunity. We went on a board planning retreat with the church in Durham, and we were sent. We went up to an ashram, a Hindu ashram on the banks of the James River up in Buckingham Courthouse, Virginia. Very interesting place, and very lovely people, very kind to us, very attentive to us, really loving, serving, making sure that we had the space and the time to do our planning the way that we wanted to. And they had a temple, a temple there, built right on the banks of the James River. And we went into it to see what it was all about. And on the top floor, they had fiber optic cables coming down from the roof. You know, the little glass tubes. You probably remember them from the 70s and the 80s. We had lamps you would put in your room, and it had all these light tubes sticking out of it. Those are the fiber optics that they use for communications. And they had this light, this beam of light would be captured by the fiber optic tubes, and it was coming down through the center of the top of the building. And then they broke out, and each tube went over to a different book stand. And on the book stand, there was one book stand for each religion. There were 12 book stands, and they were all opened, and they were open to something in the scriptures, excuse me, of that religion that talked about the light. So in Christianity, it might be that Jesus is the light of the world who has come. In Judaism, it might be let there be light, and so on, all around. And what they were demonstrating is that all of these religions, these 12 religions, were all trying to say the same thing. They were trying to express the same concept about the importance of light, which really means enlightenment, you know, wisdom. But each was trying to express it in its own way. And then they had a 13th book stand, and there was no book on it yet. And it said, this is for the next religion, or the as yet unnamed religion. So there's this idea that ideas are unfolding, that the ideas of who am I, why am I here, where am I going, what is God, all of these ideas are constantly unfolding. And we have to understand that the ideas that Jesus expressed when he was here, and the ideas as they are presented to us today, in other words, when people are saying, well, this is what Jesus said, this is what Jesus meant, all those things, they may be different. They may be different because they have blended and they have mixed and they have changed along the way. Another example is if you go to Ireland, St. Bridget is a patron saint of Ireland, a very important figure in Catholicism in Ireland. And her feast day is a day when you in the Catholic Church when you celebrate the life of this particular saint, and every day of the year is a feast day for a different saint. But St. Bridget's feast day in the Catholic Church in Ireland was fixed on a day that was already being celebrated by the Celtic religion, the religion that predated Christianity there. And it was a day when they were celebrating spring. Right? And in the Celtic religion, before there was a Saint Bridget, there was a goddess Bridget. And many of the same attributes of the goddess Bridget in the Celt religion, or Celts, are the same attributes of Saint Bridget, the Catholic saint. And of course, this leads scholars to say, well, what happened is when Catholicism came in, they just took the ideas of the previous religion, and they kind of modified them a little bit, and what had been a goddess became a saint. So we have to keep this in mind as we kind of study religions, and as Ernest Holmes says, we bless each and every religion. We look for the good in each and every religion. We take the good wherever we find it. We leave the rest behind. There is something within the human psyche itself. There's something within us that is wired to seek. Remember there was a book a few years ago called Wired for God, about how we are born to seek. There's something within us that seems to know that we're on a journey, that we're heading somewhere, that perhaps we even know that we're going back home. We're going back to wherever it was that we came from. And we seem to know that innately. We seem to know that. And all cultures seem to know that. There's something within all cultures. And that's what comes expressed as religious ideas. So we're gonna draw a little bit today from the writings of Emmett Fox, and I think you've heard me talk about Emmett Fox before. And for those on the bridge, I'm holding up for the camera a copy of his book called The Sermon on the Mount. Now, Emmett Fox, excuse me, Emmett Fox is one of my personal favorite teachers. He was an electronics engineer, or electrical engineer by training, and he understood how how mechanics worked. He understood how electricity worked. He understood how you could take energy and you could you could change it from one form to another. You could change it from electricity to heat. You could change the heat to mechanical energy that turned an engine and all those kind of things. And he was able to relate to me to the universe and to God in very simple terms. He said his goal was to take that which most people considered complex and to explain them in very simple terms. And to that degree, I think he was very successful. He had a church in New York City, and in fact, before he was a minister of any denomination, he was drawing crowds of 3,000 to 4,000 people on a Sunday. They were meeting at the Hippodrome, a racetrack over in New Jersey, which was one of the few venues large enough to hold the size audience that he could draw. So what Emmett Fox did was he went back and he said, now let's try to take these ideas of what it is that Jesus actually said while he was here. Let's try to take a look at that and see if we can kind of separate it from the other things that have kind of crept in, that people have kind of added to it, that people have kind of ascribed a meaning to it based on their worldview, based on where they were coming from. So you can imagine if you were living in Ireland and you had been practicing the religion in which Bridget was a goddess, and then all of a sudden Catholicism come in and they had Saint Bridget, and you go, oh, okay, I can understand that. They're just trying to express Bridget by a different name. They actually, they're actually worshiping Bridget, but they call her by a different name. You can see people trying to kind of fit that together, and the meaning that they come up with is more a reflection of what's in them than what might actually be in the teaching, right? So this is what we do. We hear something new, we try to relate it to something old. We try to make it fit into our existing worldview, our existing understanding of life. And then we ascribe meaning to it. And unless something in our life comes along and really challenges our understanding of that, unless something happens to us, we probably go through life, pretty happy with thinking that we've got it, we've figured it out, we understand it. But we've never got it. We don't ever have it. And the greatest danger I think there is along the spiritual path is of saying, oh yeah, now I've got it, because right then it seems like to me, everything you thought you had kind of gets rattled a little bit, and you have to go back and you have to begin to search for something even deeper, something even more meaningful. So remember, we talked about the worldviews. We talk about them over and over and over again. They appear through many different teachings, through arts, through sciences, through religion, through many different teachings, where things are kind of grouped in threes. And the first worldview is a worldview where the power is out there, and we are removed from it. The dominant emotion is fear, and what we are trying to do is through our behavior, through the way that we behave, by obeying the commandments, by obeying the rules and all those kind of things, what we are trying to do is somehow we are trying to please those who are in positions of authority. And the way that we determine what pleases them is by their behavior. This is just a very simplistic view, but if you look at society today, you will see it. You'll see it without a doubt. You know, people go into an organization, they watch for a little while what's going on in the organization. They make certain inferences about what's happening as to what is pleasing to or not pleasing to those in authority, and then they try to adjust their behavior accordingly. They try to do the things that they think are going to please those above them. And people take this worldview, they take this into religion. So in religion, they start to come to this idea that God is way out there, we're over here. We're kind of victims of God. You know, we're here, we don't know how we got here, and we got to be really careful, because anything that we do or say that's not right, any way that we behave that's not pleasing to God, why, then we can suffer the consequences. You know, we will be punished forever and ever. So in this regard, this worldview of religion, it is trying to find a way to please God. It is trying to find a way to satisfy God, to make ourselves worthy, so that we don't suffer the consequences. And in this regard, when the teachings about Jesus come into that worldview, this is very clearly where Jesus as Savior is primary. Right? Because in that worldview, there's nothing that you can do yourself that would make you worthy. There's nothing that you could do yourself that would make you please God. Nobody could live up to their own expectations of do's and don'ts. As Emmett Fox points out in his book, you know, somebody has calculated that if you look at all of the different things that you're told to do or not to do in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's over 600 things every day that you'd have to do. Well, nobody can do that. Who could possibly do that? None of us could possibly live up to that. So what we need is somebody to do it for us. So that worldview, I'm not putting it down. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, you know. But what I'm saying is that worldview kind of tends to interpret things along those lines. And this pretty much comes to us, if you study history, this idea pretty much comes to us from Zoroastrianism, from Persia. In the very Old Testament, this idea of the devil as we know it today did not exist. It wasn't there. Some scholars think that the book of Job was the very first book that was written, not Genesis, even though Genesis comes first in the way that they're assembled. But this book of Job was written first. And Job deals with the problem of evil, the theological problem of evil. If God is so good, why do people suffer? Rabbi Kushner wrote a book that was very popular years ago, when good things happen to bad people. And what that is, if you read that book and then you go read the book of Job, he's taken the book of Job, at least in my opinion, he's taken the book of Job and he's kind of stated it in more modern terms. The fundamental problem of all religions, if God is so good, why do people suffer? How could a good, a kind, a loving God, you know, punish people, send them to hell forever, you know, allow them to be born with serious diseases and all of these kinds of questions? But if you go and you read the book of Job, it starts off and you've got Satan, not the devil, not what we call the devil, but Satan. Even though we use the terms interchangeably today, you'll come to realize that they must mean different things. That Satan is in heaven with God and they're betting on how Job is going to behave when God lets the devil torment him. Or let Satan, I misspoke, let Satan torment him. So you kind of look back and think about that. How is, if Satan is the great tormentor and Satan is the one that's been cast out of heaven and Satan is the great enemy of God, why does God let Satan in heaven, and why are God and Satan taking bets on what Job is going to do? And you come to realize that the book is a book of satire. We don't get it. It's not our culture. We don't get it. But what that book is doing is it is pointing out the popular explanations of why bad things happen to good people, and it's poking fun at them. You see, it's poking fun at them. God couldn't possibly be betting with the devil, letting the devil torment you. There must be other reasons. There must be other ways. So in the very, very old times, there was not this idea of the Satan as being a living power for evil. The Satan was the divider or the distractor. What is the Satan in our own lives? Is that part of our consciousness that takes us away from where we where we want to go? We know where we want to go. There's part of us that knows, but there's part of us that wants to wander, wants to stay distracted. As Aquinas said, Augustine said, "Oh God, make me good, but not yet." God, make me good, but not yet. I really love God. I really want to be one with God, but just not yet. Just not quite yet. I'm not done having fun yet. So in the very Old Testament, this idea of a devil as being a power for evil with red horns and tights and a pitchfork and all of those concepts, it didn't exist. It did not exist. The Satan of the book of Job is not the devil of popular culture today. But when you get into Persia, when you get into Zoroastrianism, this idea of a prince of light and a prince of darkness did exist. The way that they explained the problem of evil was the reason that bad things happen is because there's this power of evil that makes them happen. In Sherlock Holmes, you had your Moriarty. Right? Sherlock Holmes said these things just don't happen. School buses just don't drive off of cliffs. There's somebody making this happen. And to Sherlock Holmes, it was Moriarty. It's the same idea. There's this power of evil. There's got to be this other power that's making it happen. And in Zoroastrianism, the idea was that there's a prince of light and a prince of darkness. Of course, prince of darkness was the devil. And they were constantly struggling and they were constantly at war with one another. And good was a little bit more powerful than evil, but evil persisted. But eventually, someday, there was going to be this final Armageddon, this final battle, where good and evil would have it out once and for all. Good would win, evil would be destroyed, and we would all kind of live happily ever after, so to speak. That idea kind of crept into Judaism after captivity in Babylon. The Jews were carried off to Persia. They got exposed to these ideas. They came back. So a lot of what has come down to us in our culture about the ideas about the power of evil and Satan and those things occurred during what is called the intertestamental times, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. These ideas were kind of formulating in consciousness, but they didn't exist in the very first forms of religious thought that come to us from the Old Testament. In that way of thinking, it's very much the way that we think now. In that way of thinking, it was that God has told people what to do, people don't do it, and people suffer consequences because of that. It's kind of like if the stove is hot and somebody tells you don't put your hand on the burner, you're going to get burned, but you put your hand on the burner anyway, you'll get burned. It's not that you're being punished. It's not that God doesn't like you. It's you just didn't do what you knew you were supposed to do. So that was the original idea, and then it kind of got turned towards this idea of the conflict of good and evil, which we have to go back and ask ourselves. We have to say, if God is all that there is and God is the source of all, then how did God create evil? How does the light create darkness is the way that we might be told in the Bible. The same well does not give forth sweet and sour water. So Emmett Fox says, let's go back and kind of look at what Jesus taught. Not what is taught about him, not what has been painted back into this landscape of the ultimate conflict of good and evil and the final battles and all of these kind of things. But let's go back and just see what he taught. Now, I'll mention this to you briefly if you want to do some more research. There is an organization called the Jesus Seminars, and I don't know how often they meet. I know Rocco Errico, who does the translations from Aramaic Bible, was part of it. But they would meet, these scholars, and they would try to determine from the scriptures what the historical Jesus, what part really applies to this historical Jesus, what the person Jesus may have said while he was here. And the way that they do that is you have to keep in mind that when Jesus was here and was speaking, most of his audience was not literate. They could not read nor write. And the way that teachers would teach in those days is through parables, through stories, through alliteration, through rhyme, through something that was catchy and it could be remembered, little visuals. That the kingdom is like a mustard seed. The kingdom is like the yeast that you put in the bread. All these little ideas that people could take away and they could remember. We remember those long after we've forgotten the actual the actual words that were used. We could listen to 500 words or read 500 words, and we'll take away 2 or 3 little visuals. Vernon Howard called them psychopictography, the pictures that carried a message, the pictures that we take away. An example, one of my mother's friends, my mom was down in a retirement community in Florida, and one of her neighbors came down with Alzheimer's, and she slowly lost her her capacity to think, and they wound up, her family wound up taking her to a facility that was better able to care for her than they were. And over time, she completely forgot everything, didn't recognize anyone. But there was a piano there, and she knew how to play the piano. And she would sit down at the piano, and she would play beautifully, and she would sing every word perfectly to these songs that she had learned 40, 50 years ago, maybe more. She was in her 80s when this happened to her. We remember the song, see, we remember the rhythm, we remember the melody, we remember the rhyme, and that's the way that the teachers would speak. So the Jesus seminars kind of go in there and they'll read a passage, and if there's a break, now you and I would hear it, if you're listening to a song and suddenly it switches to something different and then it goes back to the original song, you and I would pick that up immediately. We would know that doesn't fit. That's not right. That didn't belong there. It doesn't have the same rhythm. It doesn't have the same pace. It doesn't have the same alliteration. And the scholars who study the Bible do that. And from that, they're trying to extrapolate what it was that Jesus might actually have said while he was here, as opposed to what other people put into his mouth. You have these red letter Bibles, and just because they print the words in red doesn't mean that people actually know that that's what Jesus said. There are other people who could have come along afterwards and added things for their own purpose. So Dr. Fox says, let's go back and let's try to let go of superstition. Let's try to let go of fear. Let's try to let go of all those things, that we previously believed. Let's not try to put new wine into old skins, but let's start anew, right? In the Zen terms, the Zen mind, the beginner mind, start as if we don't know anything. And let's look at what it is that Jesus was teaching. And what Dr. Fox comes to tell us is that what Jesus was teaching us was not doctrine, was not creed, was not a theology of a particular religion, but what he was doing was giving us instruction for the growth of our soul. That the words that he's speaking are about each and every one of us, and to each and every one of us. And they're about helping us to come into a deeper realization of the presence of God. Right? Go into your closet and pray in secret. Go within and seek the kingdom. So for Jesus, the kingdom was the experience of the presence of God within. We're going within. It's not something out there. Right? It's something that we're going within. We're going within to discover. To pray in silence, to be still and know, so to speak. And if we take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, what both the scholars in the Jesus Seminar and Emmett Fox and others tell us is that what's contained in the Sermon on the Mount is kind of the summation of what Jesus taught. It's kind of like somebody took the totality, or as much as they could remember, of what Jesus taught while he was here, and they put it into one setting. Right? A story, a teaching story. And they have him going up on the hillside, and the people are sitting at his feet. And it's very important because from India, we get the Upanishads. And literally, Upanishads mean teaching received at the feet of the master. Right? So there's all these people sitting. They're sitting, and they're looking upon Jesus. He's upon the hillside, and he begins to speak to them. And he says interesting things, Let him who has ears hear, he who has eyes see. Well, what does that mean? Everybody has ears. Most people that have ears can hear. if they couldn't hear, they wouldn't even hear those words. What in the world is he talking about? And at the very beginning, he's kind of telling them, this is not what it sounds like. This is not what it seems to be. You can't just listen to the words. You have to go in deeper. You have to go in deeper. You have to go in and find that meaning within, As Emerson said, don't take anybody's word for what's good, but you have to find out for yourself what is good. And in the New Testament, I think it's John who says, you have to find out for yourself whether the gods be real gods or false gods. We have to go in and we have to experience this at a deeper level. There is that within each and every one of us that knows, because there is that within each and every one of us that is part of the omnipresence and the omniscience of God. There is that which is calling us home. And what we need to do is we need to learn how to follow that. One of my colleagues was up in Baltimore, was pastoring a church in Baltimore, and while he was there, he made an acquaintance who was a rabbi and a professor, and his specialty was in first century Christianity. And I don't know how they met, but they met, and they would go to lunch every once in a while, and they would just share ideas. And this professor was asking this religious science minister, tell me about your organization, tell me about what you teach, tell me about what you believe. And he responded, and he said, after he heard what it is that we're about, he said, you're not a religion. He said, your teaching is not a religion. He said, you don't have an ethical construct. You don't have a dogma. You don't have a creed. You don't have a doctrine. And this is true. Ernest Holmes said, as I mentioned last week, before you do anything, ask yourself, does it give a greater expression to life, love, truth, and beauty? And if so, ask yourself, does it harm anyone or take something away from anyone? And if you answer no, then go ahead and do it, because the entire universe supports you. And my colleague said to the professor, he says, what kind of doctrine or creed or construct do you think that very God has? God doesn't have a set of rules and regulations to live by. It just is. See, it just is. It's in perfect harmony with itself. And what the professor said, of all of the different teachings that he had studied, that he believed that religious science, as it was explained to him, science of mind, the teaching, that was as close to what the actual followers, the first century Christians, the actual followers of Jesus, believed and taught. So we want to go into this idea then of what is it that Jesus taught while he was here? Teaching about the growth of the soul, not teaching about organizational structures and things like that, but teaching about the growth of the soul. And we have to recognize that we can't necessarily look at it from our old ways. Again, we're told in the New Testament there comes a time you have to scrape the house down to the foundation and start all over again. So I'm just going to take a couple of excerpts from the Sermon on the Mount, and I encourage each one of you, if you don't already have this book, get a copy of it. It's still available at Amazon. There are even some excerpts in PDF format on the internet that you can go and start to read. But here's the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These are the Beatitudes. They're a part of Sermon on the Mount. Well, what does this mean to be poor in spirit? And what is the kingdom of heaven? Well, the kingdom of heaven is the awareness of the presence within. That's what we talk about. Go within and seek the kingdom. But what does it mean to be poor in spirit? Well, poor in spirit means I'm willing to say, everything that I've ever learned up until this point is possibly wrong. It has been flavored and colored by people's previous understandings. And I release all expectations of how this has to come to me, and I'm willing to let the divine within show me the way. I'm willing to be taught by the one within, right? To commune in secret, to go within, to go to the kingdom. And Dr. Fox goes on and says, the very people who were there at the time that Jesus walked the earth, the people who were in positions of authority of the established religions, didn't recognize his message, didn't understand what it was that he was saying, because they had preconceived notions about what was supposed to happen and when it was supposed to happen, and they missed it. They had the Christ, right? The Christ is the very presence of God. That within each and every one of us, when we realize that the presence of God is within us, is the Christ consciousness blooming within us. The Buddha consciousness in Buddhism, the same idea. This realization of unity, this realization of oneness. That we each come to an awareness and an understanding, and eventually to an experience, the experience of the presence of God. As Dr. Holmes put it, we want the conscious awareness of the direct experience of the divine contact. That's what we want, to have the divine contact. As Rumi would say, I don't want to be the sugar, I want to taste the sugar. We want to taste its sweetness. We want to experience the presence of the divine within. We want to go into this kingdom within. So to be poor in spirit means I'm willing to say that perhaps I don't know. Perhaps I don't know. But I'm willing to be willing. I am willing to be led. I am willing to discover that within me, the intelligence within me, that the Quakers might sit and wait to experience. I'm willing to experience that within me, which leads me on the way. Blessed are they that mourn, for they that shall be comforted. And again, it's the same. When bad things happen to good people, we start to ask ourselves, well, why did that happen? Why did that happen to me? How come, if God is so good, why did that happen? As long we're seeking God, we're seeking answers, and eventually we find out that we cause this by our own thoughts. We cause this by our own beliefs. We cause this by our own actions. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And to be meek, see, that what I'm saying is this doesn't make any sense to the old way of thinking, to the human consciousness. You go out into our competitive society now and you tell somebody, well, you have to be meek. You have to be meek if you want to inherit the kingdom of God. And people will say, yeah, well, but God helps him who helps himself. And I'm going to be aggressive and assertive, and I'm going to take what I want, and all these kind of things. You see that. Just turn on the TV. You see that. So this idea of being meek and the way that our society works are two conflicting ideas, until we realize that what they're talking about here in meekness is total trust in God. Total trust in God. I'm not trying to tell God what to do. I'm not trying to manipulate God into freeing me from the punishment that I think I deserve. Or I'm not trying to manipulate God into giving me more money so I can have a bigger house and more cars and those kind. I'm not trying to do any of that. I only want the experience of God. That's it. Again, I think it was Augustine who said, I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love. I only want thee. I'm meek. I'm meek, and when I'm working in that level of consciousness, I am meek. I only want God. And what it tells us that they shall inherit the earth. So what that means is, as Dr. Fox points out, is that as we allow ourselves to surrender, as we allow our human ego to surrender, as we allow our human desires to surrender, as we only desire in our lives those things that give a greater expression to life and love and truth and beauty, then what we find is that our affairs fall into place and into order. Then we have dominion. Then the things that are appropriate for our life appear easily and effortlessly without a sense of struggle. The next idea, and it'd be impossible to cover all of the ideas in this book in one Sunday, so I just wanted to pull a couple out. The next idea that he brings out that is familiar to all of us is it's done unto you as you believe. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, is the quote that he gives. And we come to realize that if we go back and read what it is that Jesus was saying, that over and over and over again, he was telling us in one way, in one shape, in one form or another. Change your thinking, change your life. It's done unto you according to your belief. Right? It's not the things that put into your mouth that corrupt you, but every word that comes out. See? because your words are an expression of what you believe. It's being told over and over and over again, we're being told, change your belief, change your belief, change your belief. And we're also being told that everything that I have done you can do, if you will seek the kingdom, if you will go within. Then there's the meekness. It's not me, but it's the Father within me that does these things. So he's trying to explain, as we would interpret it today, as we would look at it today, is that we have to find that divine presence within. We have to recognize that there's no one else who could possibly do it for us. No one. You know, so some of the early writings of the church, the church leaders were telling the people, don't worry about your salvation. That's up to us. You just do what we tell you to do, and everything else will be fine. Everything else will be taken care of. You know, and that's very comforting, I guess. If you're afraid, that's very comforting to say, I no longer need to be afraid because that person over there took care of it for me. But there's no one else who can grow our soul except our own self. And we have to be willing to go within. Nobody can go within us but us. Nobody can go within to find the presence of the divine within us but us. So we have to be willing. Another beatitude is blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. We have to come into that desire to experience God, to want to know God as much as we would want a pond if our hair was on fire. We start to understand that life is a matter of it being done unto us according to our belief, and instead of a power for evil making bad things happen to us, that we are in effect and in fact what we are doing is we are creating the experience of bad things in our lives by what we think and believe in our heart. As Buddhism might say, everything we experience is a result of what we have thought. So then our desire is not to behave in a manner to please some force outside of ourselves in hopes that we might escape the punishment that we feel we deserve. But then our desire comes to know God right, to know rightly, to really commune with the Spirit within. We're told in the Sermon on the Mount, we're told, resist not evil, resist not evil. What does that mean? You let evil run rampant? What does it mean? Well, it's done unto us according to our belief. If we believe in a power of evil that needs to be struggled with, then we are in effect creating it. We are keeping ourselves stuck to that which we are resisting. When we come to recognize that God is all that there is, the only source, substance, supply, the only power in the universe, when we come to truly recognize that, rather than struggling against evil, what we want to do is we want to be at home with the beloved. Be at home. To be in close companionship. There's an old saying, and I have no idea how you would prove it. There's an old saying that says that, the mind can't entertain a positive and a negative thought both at the same time. If we have our mind turned only to God, then the thought of evil does not enter our mind. Emmett Fox, again, he spoke in New York City, and he would ask people to think about the Statue of Liberty down in the harbor, and he would describe it in great detail. And he would say, okay, stop thinking about the Statue of Liberty. And he would talk a little bit, and he'd say, did everybody stop thinking about the Statue of Liberty? And of course not. They still had the Statue of Liberty on their mind. He'd say, okay, let me tell you about the Eiffel Tower. And he would start to describe the Eiffel Tower in France. And he would say, now, how many people are thinking about the Statue of Liberty? And most of them were thinking about the Eiffel Tower. So instead of resisting what you don't want, think about what you do want. Keep your mind on the things you want and off the things that you don't want. Resist not evil. Resist not evil. It has no more power than the power that you give to it. The fear, the emotion, all of these things that we give to it, they come back reflected to us, and it appears to be real. But it is not real. It is only an appearance. And one of the last things we're told is by their fruits you shall know them. By their fruits you shall know them. Which means When we really start to get it, when we really start to get into it, when we really start to get into the flow of life and to experience the oneness of the divine in our lives, well then there's outward signs of following, as Joel Goldsmith would call it. There's harmony in our life. There's peace in our life. There's love in our life. There's joy in our life. Things fall into place as they ought to fall in place. There's health in our life. These are signs following, but we can't be struggling after those things. You see, we can't be saying, well, you know, what I want is I want joy, and I've got to work hard for joy, and I've got to struggle for joy. No, we turn our mind to God. We keep our mind only on thee. My eyes are stayed only on thee. Somewhere it says, I've lifted my eyes up to the hills from whence my good comes. So what we want to consider as we go forward, in a couple of weeks when it gets to be Easter, we're going to be talking about the symbolism of death and resurrection, what it means to us metaphysically. But what I would hope that we take out of today is this realization that perhaps what we are hearing in pop culture, perhaps what we are hearing from many, many different organizations that all claim to be teaching the same thing but are not, because they're different. And I'm not saying that they're wrong or that they're bad. I'm saying everybody's got their own worldview. We have to understand that there's perhaps another, perhaps there's a different one. Perhaps there's a metaphysical or a spiritual interpretation. Perhaps there's what Jesus said, and then there's what people say he said. And we have to be willing to take it upon ourselves to go within, to do our research, do our homework, but mostly to go within and to see what that still small voice within tells us. Now, it may be difficult. A lot of us, when we grew up, we might have been told, don't go within, you can't trust yourself, right? But Jesus said, go within. So what I invite everyone to do is to go within this week. Go within. Recognize that there is a power and a guidance within. That which is true will resonate, kind of like Ella Fitzgerald breaking the crystal glass with her voice. There's that which resonates. There's that within us that knows the truth. There's that which speaks to our soul. There's that, and these are all different ways people describe it. There's that which plucks the string of our heart and lets it vibrate. Go within. Take the good wherever you find it. Listen to the scriptures of the world. There's good everywhere. There's good in all of it. Leave the fear and the doubt and the superstition behind. There is a wonderful message in the teachings of Jesus. There is a wonderful message for the growth of all of our souls. There is a wonderful message that is telling us that the love that has created us out of itself is still with us, still right here, still in our hearts, still in our minds, still in our bodies. It is gently calling us home. Meister Eckhart lived around the year 1300. He was a German monk and a mystic. And he once told his congregation that God is like the person who plays hide and seek with you and then clears his voice so that you will find him. There's beautiful love within each and every one of us waiting to be discovered, waiting for us to find it. Let's follow the teaching. Let's go within. Let's change our thinking to eliminate everything and anything that might block or temporarily obstruct. And the way we do that is by knowing that nothing can stand in the way of God. Divine love is trying to give itself to us, just waiting for us to accept. Let this be the year that we accept. And so it is.